The wind howled and the snow whipped around them as the group of friends stumbled through the blizzard, hopelessly lost. They had been out hiking in the mountains when the storm had hit, and now they were struggling to find their way back to their cabin. As the darkness closed in around them, one of the friends, Sarah, spotted a faint light in the distance. They stumbled towards it, and as they got closer, they saw that it was an abandoned cabin. With no other options, they entered the cabin, grateful for the shelter from the storm. The cabin was old and musty, but it seemed to be intact. They lit a fire and settled in for the night, hoping that the storm would pass and they could find their way back to safety in the morning. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The fire flickered and danced, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The floorboards creaked and groaned as though something was moving around the cabin. And then they heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible above the sound of a blizzard outside. The friends tried to brush it off, telling themselves that it was just the wind or their imagination. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. They were not alone in the cabin, and whatever was there with them was not friendly. As they huddled together for warmth, they began to notice strange symbols etched into the walls and the floor, symbols that they could not identify, but that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The atmosphere in the cabin grew more tense and disturbing with every passing moment, and the friends knew that they were in grave danger. But there was nowhere else for them to go, no escape from the horrors that lurked in the shadows. Little did they know, the cabin held dark secrets that would soon be revealed, and that they may not survive the night. As the night wore on, the friends could feel a growing sense of unease. The whispers seemed to be getting louder and more distinct, and they could no longer ignore them. They huddled together, trying to make sense of what was happening. But it was no use. They were trapped in the cabin, and something malevolent was stalking them. Suddenly, there was a loud bang at the door. The friends jumped, and one of them screamed in terror. They could hear something scratching and clawing at the door, trying to get in. One of the friends, Mark, bravely approached the door and tried to open it, but it was stuck fast, and the scratching and banging grew louder and more frenzied. They could hear a low growling sound, and they knew that whatever was on the other side of the door was not human. As they cowered in fear, the door suddenly burst open, and a dark figure loomed in the doorway. It was shrouded in shadows, and they could not make out its features, but they knew that it was not friendly. The figure advanced on them, and they could see its eyes gleaming in the darkness. They were filled with a deep malevolence that sent chills down their spines. The friends tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped, and they knew that they were going to die. Just as the figure was about to pounce, there was a blinding flash of light, and the figure vanished into thin air. The friends looked around in confusion, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but they knew that they were still in grave danger. As the night wore on, the friends were plagued by nightmares and terrifying visions. They saw grotesque, twisted creatures lurking in the shadows, and they heard whispers and voices that seemed to come from beyond the grave. They knew that they were no longer alone in the cabin, and that they were facing something far more sinister than they could ever have imagined. But they also knew that they had to find a way to escape, or they would never make it out alive. The night dragged on, and the friends could feel their strength waning. They were cold, hungry, and terrified, and they knew that they had to find a way to survive until morning. As they huddled together, trying to stay warm, they heard a faint scratching sound coming from the floorboards. They looked down and saw a small black rat scurrying across the floor. But as they watched, the rat began to grow and change, its body contorting and twisting until it was no longer a rat at all. It had become something else entirely, something dark and twisted and full of malevolent energy. The friends tried to run, but they were too weak and too terrified to move. They watched in horror as the creature advanced on them, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Just as it was about to pounce, there was a blinding flash of light, and the creature vanished into thin air. The friends looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but they knew that they were still in grave danger. As the night wore on, the friends were plagued by nightmares and visions of the cabin's dark past. They saw flashes of an old man, muttering dark incantations in a language they could not understand. They saw images of blood and sacrifice, and they knew that they were trapped in a place that was steeped in evil. But as dawn broke, they heard the sound of rescue teams searching for them, and they knew that they had a chance to escape. They stumbled out of the cabin, weak and disoriented, and collapsed in the snow. As they were taken to safety, they looked back at the abandoned cabin, knowing that they had narrowly escaped with their lives. They knew that they had faced something far more sinister than they could ever have imagined, and that the cabin held dark secrets that they could never fully understand. But one thing was certain, they would never forget the horrors of that night, and the abandoned cabin would haunt them forever. The Johnsons were a typical suburban family of four. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson had been married for 10 years and had 2 children, Sarah, who was 6, and Timmy, who was 8. They had decided to take a family vacation to visit Mr. Johnson's sister, who lived in a cabin in the remote mountains. The drive up was uneventful, and the family enjoyed the scenic views. However, things took a turn for the worse when a blizzard hit. The roads were quickly covered in snow, and visibility was reduced to almost zero. Mr. Johnson tried to continue driving, but the car eventually got stuck in a snowbank. The family was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no phone reception and no way to call for help. They decided to hunker down in the car and wait for the storm to pass. At first, they tried to make the best of it. They played games and told stories to pass the time. But as the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The family started to hear eerie noises outside, like something scratching at the car windows. Mr. Johnson tried to reassure everyone that it was just the wind, but the noises continued to escalate. As the hours ticked by, the family began to see strange figures moving in the snow outside. They were too far away to make out any details, but their presence was unmistakable. Sarah and Timmy were terrified, and Mrs. Johnson was starting to panic. Mr. Johnson tried to keep a level head, but even he was beginning to feel uneasy. The family had no idea what was going on, but one thing was clear. They were not alone. Something was out there, and it was getting closer. The wind howled outside, and the snow kept piling up. The Johnsons tried to keep warm by huddling together in the car and wrapping themselves in blankets, but the eerie noises and sightings outside only continued to escalate. As the night wore on, the family members started to feel a sense of dread. The figures outside were getting closer, and they could now make out some details. They appeared to be humanoid, but their movements were jerky and unnatural. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and their breaths came out in puffs of white. Mr. Johnson tried to calm his family by telling them that it was just their imagination playing tricks on them. He told them that they were safe inside the car, and that help would come soon. But deep down, he knew that something was very wrong. Suddenly, the car was jolted by a loud thud. The family screamed in terror as they saw a handprint on the window. It was much larger than any human hand, and it was covered in scales. The creature outside let out a low growl, and the family knew that they were in grave danger. They huddled together in the car, trying to think of a way out. But their options were limited. They couldn't drive the car because it was stuck, and they couldn't leave it because the creatures outside were too dangerous. As they waited in terror, the creatures started to attack the car. They pounded on the windows with their fists, trying to break through. The family was too scared to move, paralyzed by fear. Just when they thought it was all over, a sudden gust of wind swept through the area, and the creatures disappeared. The family was left alone in the snow, shaken but unharmed, but they knew that they had just narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. The Johnsons were confused and relieved when they woke up the next morning to find their car surrounded by the remnants of a blizzard. There was no sign of the creatures that had terrorized them the night before, but the family knew they couldn't stay in the car any longer. Mr. Johnson decided that they needed to try to hike back down the mountain to find help. The family packed up what supplies they had left, and they set out on foot. The journey was treacherous, with the snowdrifts reaching up to their waists and the wind howling in their ears. As they trudged through the snow, the Johnsons couldn't help but feel like they were being watched. They kept turning around to see if the creatures were following them, but there was no sign of them. However, the feeling of unease only grew stronger as they made their way down the mountain. After several hours of hiking, the Johnsons finally saw a light in the distance. They quickened their pace, and soon they found themselves at a small ranger station. The rangers were surprised to see the family, but they welcomed them inside and gave them hot cocoa and blankets. As the Johnsons warmed up, they recounted their harrowing experience to the rangers. The rangers listened intently, but they didn't seem too surprised. They told the Johnsons that there had been reports of strange sightings in the mountains for years, and that many people believed that the area was haunted by spirits. The Johnsons were shaken by the ranger's words, but they were relieved to be safe. They waited at the ranger station until the storm passed, and then they made their way back home. The wind howled through the trees, the snow falling heavily upon the forest floor. Emily trudged through the snow, her backpack heavy on her shoulders. She had been hiking for hours, determined to reach the summit of the remote mountain, but the blizzard had come on quickly and without warning. She checked her compass, but it was no use. The snow was too thick, and she couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. Emily realized she was lost. She began to panic, her breath coming in short gasps. She had to find shelter soon, or she would die out in the cold. As she stumbled through the woods, Emily saw a faint light in the distance. She quickened her pace, and soon she found herself standing before a small cabin. She breathed a sigh of relief and tried the door. It was unlocked. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The cabin was small, with only one room, a wood-burning stove, and a small table and chairs. There was a bed in the corner, and a few blankets piled on top. Emily was grateful for the warmth and shelter, but something about the cabin made her uneasy. The walls were covered in strange symbols and drawings, and there was a faint smell of decay in the air. Emily shook it off, chalking it up to the storm and her own paranoia. But as the hours passed, Emily began to feel more and more uneasy. The cabin's strange symbols and drawings seemed to glow in the firelight, and the smell of decay grew stronger. She tried to shake off the feeling, but it was impossible. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone in the cabin, that someone or something was watching her. Emily tried to shake off her unease by exploring the cabin. She found a small library of books, but they were all about the occult and witchcraft. There were strange markings on the pages, and some of the pages were missing. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Who had lived here before her? She decided to leave the cabin and try to find her way back to civilization, but the blizzard raged on. Emily was trapped. As the night wore on, the cabin seemed to take on a life of its own. The strange symbols and drawings on the walls seemed to writhe and twist, and the smell of decay grew stronger. Then she heard a noise. It was a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She tried to tell herself it was just the storm, but she knew that wasn't true. Something was in the cabin with her. Emily searched the cabin, but found nothing out of the ordinary. She tried to stay calm, but the fear inside her was growing. She thought about leaving the cabin again, but the storm was still raging outside. She was stuck here, alone with whatever was in the cabin with her. As the night wore on, Emily's fear turned to terror. The scratching sounds continued, and she could hear whispering voices coming from the walls. She tried to block them out, but they were impossible to ignore. Emily realized that she wasn't alone in the cabin. There was something else there with her, something that wanted to harm her. Emily's mind raced as she tried to come up with a plan. She thought about trying to break a window and escape, but she knew the storm was too strong. She tried to call for help on her phone, but there was no signal. Emily was completely alone, trapped in the cabin with her unseen enemy. Just as Emily was about to give up hope, she heard a voice. It was faint at first, but it grew louder and clearer. "Get out," the voice said. "Get out before it's too late." Emily was stunned. Who was speaking to her? She looked around the cabin, but there was no one there. The voice continued, urgent and insistent. "Get out now, before it's too late." Emily didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her backpack and ran to the door. She flung it open and stepped outside. The blizzard was still raging, but Emily didn't care. She ran as fast as she could through the snow, her heart pounding in her chest. As she stumbled through the woods, Emily heard a sound behind her. She turned to look and saw a figure in the doorway of the cabin. It was dark and shadowy, and Emily couldn't make out its features, but she knew that it was the thing that had been in the cabin with her. Emily ran faster, her fear giving her strength. She didn't stop until she reached the ranger station at the base of the mountain. She burst through the door, panting and sweating, and collapsed on the floor. The rangers helped her to her feet and took her to a warm room. They asked her what had happened, but Emily couldn't find the words to explain. All she could do was shake and shiver. her mind replaying the events of the night over and over again. It wasn't until the next day, when the storm had passed, that Emily was able to return to the cabin. But when she got there, she found that it was completely empty. There were no symbols on the walls, no smell of decay in the air. It was as if the cabin had never been occupied at all. The sound of the engine roared through the darkness, the only source of light coming from the headlights as the car navigated through the storm. Samantha shivered in the passenger seat, huddled in her jacket as she watched the snow whip past the window. "We should have stayed put," she muttered, turning to her friend Emily in the backseat. "We could have waited out the storm at the motel." Emily just shrugged, her face unreadable in the dim light. "We needed to keep moving. We can't afford to lose any more time." The car hit a patch of ice, swerving dangerously close to the edge of the road. John, the driver, swore under his breath as he wrestled the car back onto the narrow track. "We're going to have to take a detour," he said, his voice tense. "The main road is too dangerous. We'll have to cut through the woods." Samantha's heart sank. She had a bad feeling about this, but she knew they had no other choice. They were on a tight schedule, and they couldn't afford to get stranded in the middle of nowhere. As they turned onto the back road, the wind howled even louder, the snow coming down in thick, swirling flakes. It was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "We're going to have to slow down," John said, his hands tight on the wheel. "I can't see a damn thing." As they crawled forward, the road becoming narrower and more treacherous, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She turned to Emily, but her friend was asleep, her head lolling against the window. Suddenly, John slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. Ahead of them, something had darted across the road, too quick for them to see. "What was that?" Samantha whispered, her heart racing. "I don't know," John said, his voice low, "but we're not alone up here." The car crept forward, every nerve in Samantha's body on edge. She strained to see through the blizzard, but all she could make out were the bare branches of the trees clawing at the sky. And then she saw it. A dark figure, hunched over and shambling towards them from the side of the road. At first, she thought it was a person, but as it drew closer, she realized it was something else entirely. Its skin was a sickly gray, its eyes sunken and glazed, and it was dragging something heavy behind it, leaving a trail in the snow. "John, go!" she screamed, but it was too late. The figure was upon them, slamming into the car with a force that rocked them from side to side. "What the hell is that?" Emily cried, waking up with a start. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," John said, slamming on the gas. The car lurched forward, but it was too late. They were surrounded by them, a horde of creatures, their faces twisted in grotesque snarls. "We have to fight," Samantha said, grabbing a tire iron from the back seat. John nodded, his face set in determination. "We're not going down without a fight." The creatures descended upon them, their claws raking at the windows as they tried to break through. Samantha swung the tire iron, connecting with one of them and sending it tumbling into the snow. But there were too many of them, and soon they were overwhelmed. The car rocked violently as the creatures battered at it from all sides, their snarls and howls filling the air. "We have to get out of here," John yelled over the din. "We'll have to make a run for it." Samantha nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. They all knew the odds were against them, but they had to try. As John opened the door and jumped out, Samantha and Emily followed, sprinting towards the trees. The snow was knee-deep, slowing them down, but they kept going, their fear giving them strength. Behind them, the creatures pursued, their footsteps crunching in the snow. Samantha risked a glance back and saw them closing in, their eyes fixed on their prey. They were almost at the trees when Emily stumbled, falling face first into the snow. Samantha stopped to help her, but it was too late. The creatures were upon them, grabbing at their clothes and hair, tearing at their flesh with their sharp claws. Samantha fought back, swinging the tire iron with all her might, but it was no use. They were outnumbered and outmatched. And then, suddenly, the creatures backed off, their howls turning into snarls of frustration. Samantha looked up and saw a figure standing amidst the chaos, holding a torch in one hand and a rifle in the other. "Get in," he shouted, motioning to a truck parked nearby. Samantha didn't hesitate, dragging Emily to her feet and running towards the truck. John was already inside, his eyes wide with terror. The figure climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, hitting the gas and tearing out of the clearing. They drove in silence for what felt like hours, the storm still raging around them. Samantha couldn't believe they had made it out alive. "Who are you?" she finally asked, turning to the figure. The man didn't answer, his face set in a grim expression. But as he drove, he began to hum a tune, a haunting melody that made Samantha's blood run cold. And then she realized with a sickening feeling in the pit of her stomach that it was the same tune the creatures had been humming as they closed in for the kill. The road to nowhere had taken them to the edge of madness, and they had barely escaped with their lives. But Samantha knew that the memory of that night would haunt her for the rest of her days. It was a bitterly cold winter night, and the snow was coming down hard. The kind of snow that seems to have a life of its own, blowing sideways in the fierce wind and piling up so high that it could bury a car. John had been a snowplow driver for over 10 years, and he knew the roads like the back of his hand. But this storm was different. It was one of the worst he had ever seen. John knew he had a job to do. He had to clear the roads, no matter how bad the storm got. He got into his plow truck and started to make his way down the first road on his list. The snow was so deep that the plow had trouble pushing it aside, but John was determined to get the job done. As he plowed his way down the road, he began to notice something strange. Something was following him. He couldn't quite see what it was, but he could feel its presence. It was like a cold, icy breath on the back of his neck. John tried to shake the feeling, but it only grew stronger as he continued down the road. John decided to take a break at the side of the road. He got out of the plow truck and looked around, trying to see what was following him. But the snow was coming down so hard that he could barely see 5 feet in front of him. He decided to get back in the truck and keep going. As he continued down the road, the feeling of being followed grew stronger. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He tried to tell himself that it was just his imagination, but he knew deep down that it wasn't. The storm continued to rage around him as he plowed his way through the snow. The wind was howling, and the snow was blinding. John was starting to wonder if he would make it home alive. That's when he heard it, a soft whisper carried on the wind. It was a voice, but he couldn't quite make out what it was saying. John stopped the truck and turned off the engine, straining to hear what the voice was saying. It was then that he heard it again, louder this time. It was a woman's voice, and it was saying his name. John was frozen with fear. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had to get out of there. He started the truck and sped down the road, trying to get away from the voice. But the voice followed him, growing louder and more insistent with every passing moment. John was starting to lose control of the truck. The snow was coming down so hard that he couldn't see the road in front of him. He was careening out of control, swerving left and right. That's when he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. John slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The truck skidded towards the figure, and he braced himself for impact. But just before he hit the figure, it vanished into thin air. John was shaking with fear. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. He started the truck and drove home as fast as he could, not stopping until he reached the safety of his own driveway. As he sat in his truck, trying to catch his breath, he realized that the voice had stopped. He was safe, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there watching him. The next morning, John woke up to find that the storm had passed. The sun was shining, and the sky was a brilliant shade of blue. He got dressed and headed out to inspect the roads. As he drove down the first road on his list, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He looked around, but there was nothing there. He tried to tell himself that it was just his imagination, but he couldn't shake the feeling. Days turned into weeks, and John continued to feel like he was being watched. The feeling never left him, no matter where he went. It was always there, lurking just out of sight. John started to feel like he was going crazy. He tried to tell himself that it was just stress from the storm, but he knew deep down that it was something more. One night, as he was driving home from work, he saw something in a rearview mirror, something that made his blood run cold. It was a figure standing in the middle of the road, the same figure he had seen during the storm, the figure that had been following him. John slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the truck, ready to confront whatever was out there. But when he got to where the figure had been standing, there was nothing there. It had vanished into thin air, just like before. John realized that he was dealing with something beyond his understanding, something that was beyond human. He knew that he had to get out of there before it was too late. The next morning, John packed his bags and left town. He never looked back. But even now, years later, he can still feel the cold, icy breath of the thing that was following him, and he knows that he will never be truly safe, no matter where he goes.